Okay, welcome back, everybody. Thank you so much for being with us. You have just joined the Might of Tiny Victory Gardens workshop with Acadia Tucker. I'm Chadley Kolb in NOFA, New Hampshire. I'll be moderating this with my co-workers, Nikki and Laura. Hello. We're asking everybody, please keep yourselves muted during the workshop. Type your questions into the chat box. We'll read them out towards the end during the Q&A portion. And please note, we are recording this meeting. All workshop sessions will become available to you after the conference. And without further ado, I should like to now introduce you to Acadia Tucker. Okay.
Hi, everybody. How are you doing? We'll get the slideshow up and running. So my name is Acadia Tucker. I am an organic grower. I started off with my own organic market garden out in Washington State and have since moved back to my hometown where now I work as a hops grower for the local beer industry, which is really fun. I'm also joined here today with my friend Emily. She co-authored the latest book with me called Tiny Victory Gardens, Growing Food Without a Yard. She's kind of running the slides behind the scenes, but everybody can kind of give her a wave. So let's just get started. Today, we're going to kind of cover the might and benefits of having tiny victory gardens, how to grow living soil in your containers, finding the right amount of light, the best design principles for small spaces that can help maximize your yield, the best pots and planters that you can use, what to do before you plant, a bit of tiny inspiration, as I like to call it, with some varieties of plants, and some general upkeep. So container gardening is something that's relatively new for me. As I'd mentioned, my experience comes from organic market gardening. But as I was kind of working the soil, trying to create living soil on my own farm, I started to realize that, you know, this can be taken and shrunk down to a smaller scale for people at home to use. So I've written 2 other books which kind of focused on the power of backyard gardens to store and sequester carbon to help cool the planet. And while admittedly, I know container gardens will not have the same carbon sucking power as a small backyard garden can be, it still has tons of other benefits that people can utilize for the planet and for your community. So one of the first benefits that this kind of talk will center around is what kind of potting mix you should use. And in my opinion, filling your planter with compost-rich potting mix, and that means teaming with microbial life and fungi, means your plants will not only be easier to tend, but also more nutritious. And at the very least, you can spend way less time watering, and you can also ditch the synthetic fertilizers and pesticides that do way more harm than good. But one of my favorite aspects of putting tiny gardens all over the place it's an excellent way to support your pollinators, which have taken a huge hit in recent years thanks to climate change and the overuse of pesticides. Since their introduction in the 1990s, a dangerous class of insecticides, which is called neonicotinoids, it's a bit of a tongue twister, has become widely used. And during the same time, the total biomass of insects worldwide has plummeted by as much as 80%. And with those population crash of our insects and pollinators, so do the birds and the other animals that depend on them as well. So it's pretty dangerous. So planting flowers and food in pots can create a zone for pollinators, not only in urban environments where food is already scarce, but also in suburban areas, which are usually filled with manicured lawns, which can be considered kind of a biological wasteland. And the reason it's so important to support these pollinators is because many of them can't fly very far and their habitats are shrinking significantly. They become isolated from the food and from each other. So planting a cross-country corridor of balcony crops, rooftop oases, backyard container gardens is just one way we can help these beneficial insects find enough food so that they can in turn pollinate our crops. The fact that container gardening allows anyone to grow food no yard required, leads to another benefit that I'm really excited about. While it can't do much to mitigate climate change in the fact of, actually being able to draw down carbon, it can definitely help us adapt to it. So in two recent reports from the IPCC found that climate change combined with the unprecedented rate of exploitation of our world's land and water resources is already putting an immense strain on crop productions, not to mention the wildfires, the droughts, the diminishing aquifers. The future of agriculture can be quite scary when you think about it. So cultivating your own food is a meaningful way to promote resilience in your household. And by sharing your knowledge with neighbors, it can do the same for your community. On my own little farm in Point Roberts, was able to actually help out during the pandemic as well. It's part of a peninsula, and the border is cut off from Canada. So to get into the point, you actually have to go into Canada and back into the US, and they were completely cut off. So the farm that I helped create in my small town actually went above and beyond, feeding our community during the pandemic. And it is also in these chaotic times that we start to get nostalgic for the last time US citizens came together, which was most notably during the First and Second World War, where the government started to pitch these things that they called a climate victory garden. So they believed that it's every citizen's patriotic duty to start growing food in any spot of land possible. And at the height of the movement, nearly 20 million victory gardens across the country were established, growing 40% of the nation's food. So to me, that just says, we've done it once before, and I think it's time that we call for another victory gardening movement. And, with container gardenings, nobody will be left out of that. So I started to get interested in soil when I started farming. The first time I walked around my 2-acre property, which I signed sight unseen, it was definitely a little anxious. I had quickly noticed that there wasn't much soil at all to work with, which is pretty terrifying when you're thinking about starting a farm. So to get around this dirt problem, we decided that we would build some cedar raised beds so that we could quickly fill them and get at least the spring greens going while we tackled the rest of the fields. So we built our beds, we found affordable soil, the community all helped out filling the beds, and we thought we were off to a good start. Then we turned to our field, and since we couldn't really dig because there was the construction fill everywhere and we couldn't really remove it, we decided to build our own soil on top of the ground. And we did this by a technique that I'm sure all of you know relatively well, called sheet mulching. So you layer out cardboard and organic materials like food debris, grass clippings, leaves, compost, and you kind of pile it up into a mound where it just sits in place and decomposes into beautiful, beautiful soil. And once we did this and we saw how spectacularly our field crops grew in this soil versus how terribly they were growing in our raised beds filled with, the soil we didn't really know the origins from. So it got me thinking, that the soil really does matter. I went back to school to study soil science, and I came back to the farm with a very, very new appreciation for just how wonderful compost is. And I've really never turned back since. So I've mentioned the term living soil a few times, and I just wanted to give a brief introduction as to what I mean by that. There's so much going on below ground that just a gram of healthy soil can contain more than 1 billion bacteria, many yards of fungal strands, and thousands of protozoa, and then even more. To date, we only know a small fraction of this underground community, and even fewer of its residents have been studied. So what we know is that we need microbial organisms to build soil fertility, curb disease, fight pests, lock in moisture, and quite frankly, we'd be lost without them. So the basis of this living soil food web is organic material like compost. These critters eat the compost and in return provide nutrients for plants. They also have the power to, as mentioned, draw down carbon. go to the next, yeah, perfect. To draw down carbon. So as plants photosynthesize, they create these sugars that the microorganisms feed on. Once that carbon enters the microorganisms' bodies and they die off, that carbon is stored below ground as long as it's not disturbed. So building living soil not only creates and nourishes healthy plants, but it also has that added environmental benefit that is just really powerful. So as we're talking about container gardening versus in-ground gardening, the very first step everybody needs to kind of think about is what kind of potting mix or soil should you use in your pots? And there's no reason why we can't cultivate living soil in our container gardens. But you do have to start with a good potting mix. I learned this the hard way when I shoveled my lovely rich garden soil into my pots. I thought it was going to be the perfect start for my plants, but I quickly learned that garden soil, which is pretty heavy laden with clay, is not a great material to be putting into a pot. It suffocated my plants, it didn't drain well, and I had to start over again. So potted plants do best in a potting mix made from materials that hold nutrients and water without that extra weight of clay. And even more important, and I can never stress it enough, that it absolutely has to drain well. For that reason, potting soil fashioned for container growing isn't really soil at all. It's mostly made from the same basic ingredients, which is peat for water retention, sand for weight, and vermiculite or perlite for porosity. But for the eco-conscious gardener, finding the right potting mixes can actually be quite challenging. Peat, which is derived from the decaying of wetlands, takes a really long time to build up. And the high demand for potting soil and other peat products means that bogs are being harvested at unsustainable rates. This is worrisome because it's destroying an important ecosystem, which also has huge implications for climate change. Bogs store a significant amount of the world's organic carbon, about a third of it, and extracting and farming this peat releases that back into the atmosphere. So this is a very energy intensive and bad practice. So I check to see if my potting mixes, and I try to make sure they don't have peat. Again, it can be difficult to find the best potting mix, but everybody should try their best. So your best bet is to search for a compost-based organic potting mix certified by the Organic Materials Review Institute. And if that's hard to find, you can just mix a bag of compost with a bag of potting mix, ideally in kind of a 1-to-1 blend. But the compost matters as well because that's what's going to enrich your potting mix with this microbial life. Without it, it will just be inert. But if you're a little more adventurous or you really want to go, all out, you can make your own potting mix. And my homemade recipe is a mixture of compost, coconut coir, which is kind of a peat alternative, and pumice stone for aeration and drainage. I mix all of these ingredients in a big plastic tub and I just store it and use it whenever I need. Lastly, and this is because I like to cram so many plants into my planters, I boost my soil mix with organic amendments. My favorites are crab meal, kelp meal, and neem seed meal. The crab meal offers a steady supply of nitrogen and phosphorus and calcium, and it's also considered a biopesticide because it promotes soil organisms to release special enzymes that actually destroy some soil pests like harmful nematodes. The other thing I like to do is inoculate my soil. So again, adding more of this microbial life into your potting mix will just help your plants thrive. And if it's tough to find good compost, this is kind of a workaround. So you can inoculate your potting mix with mycelium, or you can use something like a compost tea that has tons of microbes already in it. If you live in an apartment and you don't want to steep compost and until you have a compost tea, you can also buy this product called EM1, and it's a naturally fermented live microbial blend that you can just pour into your potting mix. And I just want to warn you to be careful because even though these things don't look alive, they are very much alive. So say you accidentally leave it in the car overnight after you get home from the nursery, most likely they will freeze in this weather. So it's just important to take care of them as they are living things. So when I lived in Washington, my house was hidden under a very dense canopy of cedar trees, and not much sun ever reached the lawn. So the only reliable light I had was this sliver that moved with the season, but I leaned into it and I planted tomatoes just because. That spring, it was very convenient because that light stood right outside my sliding glass door. But by the fall, that container of tomatoes ended up into the middle of my driveway. Which is just kind of proving a point that, you know, where you put your containers does matter, especially if you want to maximize your yield and actually produce a meaningful amount of food. So to help you choose the right location, you can ask yourself a few questions. What grows well in your region? Are you interested in growing food year round? If so, you'll have to grow food indoors at least part of the time for the most part. Do you have the room to keep plants inside, or even the interest? Because some people don't. And how much of a commitment are you willing to make? So for me, it's important to grow as much food as I can. And I'm okay with doing the weekly waterings and, you know, living with plants in my house. But don't feel like you need to bite off more than you can chew. I always encourage people to start small, start with one potted herb and see how it goes. You'll gain your confidence and you'll start adding more plants to your garden. So figuring out where to put your garden can involve a few different calculations once you've kind of decided your location. But the single most important is where it's going to get the light. Any sunny surface is fair game. Most crops require a minimum of 6 to 8 hours, but I find if you give them 10 or more, they grow faster, they produce more, and they just thrive a little bit better. So finding light outdoors is easy enough. I like to use what I call a sun map, which you can see in the bottom corner here. I observe the sun at three times during the day and draw circles, and where those circles intersect, I know is the sunniest spot. So I use that to outside, I put my citrus trees in that sunniest corner of my patio before moving them inside for the winter. But the indoor gardener faces an additional challenge because while it's obvious that shades and curtains can filter the sun, you may not realize it, but windows do as well. Even a clear window can limit 30 to 70% of the direct sunlight coming into your window. So even if your plants are directly on a windowsill and they get sun for most of the day, it just might not be intense enough. So that's why a lot of indoor gardeners can rely on things like grow lights. Also, which windows you choose or which rooms you choose to grow plants in matter as well for orientation. So obviously south-facing windows and rooms are the best, and most north-facing windows and rooms will just simply never get enough light to grow crops. So you'll need to use grow lights. I have to admit that before I started growing food in containers, I definitely didn't give design any thought. As a farmer, my priority was making sure that the plants were well spaced and my rows reasonably straight. I wasn't really thinking of making anything pretty or designing anything. But I did find through container gardening with smart design, by working with nature, making it look good, and they can all add up to maximize your harvest. So this is my favorite way to design my garden, is to work with nature. And I use this design principle to attract more beneficial bugs and birds, like flowering dill, which can draw in beneficial hoverflies, which eat caterpillar larvae before they even hatch. And I recently paired flowers with some of my slow to pollinate crops, and I've had great success, and there's bugs buzzing around them all the time. So I've kind of changed my tune. I used to pull any plant that looked ready to bolt, like cilantro, for example, but now I kind of leave it be, and those blooms help to feed the tiny pollinators. And then an added benefit, some of these self-sowing annuals just crop up each spring without me having to do anything. So I kind of have a perennial cilantro pot, if you will, out on my porch that just provides me with tons of cilantro, and I literally don't have to do a thing. And having sworn off synthetic pesticides years ago, I also rely on a number of organic pest solutions, a few of which involve pairing vulnerable plants with ones that can fend off pests. So I've planted chives and other aromatic herbs along, say, my broccoli and cabbage plants to help fight off leaf miners and cabbage worms. But my favorite trick was how I deal with my flea beetles. So I get attacked by flea beetles every year. They're the worst pest. They just put pinholes in everything. So I started planting decoy plants around my potted containers to draw the flea beetles off of the crops that I wish to keep hole free, and to say to radish leaves. So they eat the radish leaves and then they go on their way, and the radish roots left behind are still delicious as ever. The last thing I like to do is also plant a lot of perennials in pots, because that they stay put over the winter, their roots, they provide some extra habitat for beneficial bugs as well as the soil organisms so that they can overwinter as well. So food gardens are usually filled with food chosen for taste rather than looks. But I've learned, and this is true, especially if you're trying to grow food indoors, you're going to live with them. You're going to see them every day. Do you really want a scraggly cucumber on your table, just trailing across, searching for any light that it can get? So I've started to, experiment with how can I make almost floral arrangements, but out of my food containers. And I started off just by choosing, a color-centric approach. One of my favorite containers to plant is this deep purple lettuce with chartreuse arugula and just the alternating bands. Looks really good. And whenever people come over, they're definitely drawn to it. But it wasn't until a recent conversation with a florist that I was kind of changed my color-centric approach. And I have to admit, it is a little bit cliche, but in the flower world, they have a saying that they aim to thrill, fill, and spill. So basically what this means is thinking of your containers as a structural entity with 3 layers of interest. And not only does this look good, but it will actually maximize the space that you can have in the amount of food you can grow in one container. So the thrill is used to describe that eye-catching plant. It's usually tall, like beans climbing up a trellis, or a tall tomato on a stalk. And then you can pop in plants around that center plant, which we call the fill. So common fill plants that I really like to work with are lettuce, spinach, edible flowers, carrots. And then the last layer is that spill. So it's any plant that can kind of flop over the edge of your container, whether it be trailing cucumbers or nasturtiums. It adds, again, just more space to one container, so you can really actually grow a significant amount of food in quite a small space. Along that same vein, you can maximize your harvest. I do this a few ways. I alternate my cool and warm season crops if I'm growing them outside, and sorting plants into this category means you can grow those that are quick to ripen and those that are slow to ripen all in the same container. So for example, I'll plant cool season radishes in the spring. I'll harvest them once they're mature, and that's usually just in time for the weather to warm up. Then I'll drop in some, let's say, warm season peppers, and then I'll even squeak out a third crop after the peppers are done by planting again another cool season plant like lettuce. So out of that one container, I've now harvested, multiple crops multiple times. I also like to plant crops one after another in kind of like a rapid succession. So as soon as one crop is pulled, I'm either dropping seeds or seedlings into that space just to make sure that there's no soil left bare. You can also stagger your start dates within one container. So say, for example, tomatoes, if you don't want them all to ripen at once, you can stagger them a few weeks apart, and that one container will provide, ripe tomatoes for many, many, many months. And you can even bring it inside when the threat of frost comes and keep harvesting, into November if you want. as mentioned before too, I also like to plant companions together. And this is a simple way so you're not swapping plants in and out of containers all the time. So it works particularly well with perennial plants. And again, it provides that kind of natural, if you team up the right plants like herbs, it can provide that natural pest resistance. And then another way to kind of maximize that space is to utilize what we call zigzag planting. So rather than, excuse me, planting in rows, you can plant in triangles, and that just creates more space for more plants. So the truth is about container planting that there is no such thing as a perfect pot. Each type of material has its pros and cons. So it's really just learning about how each material behaves and how it interacts with the soil to just mitigate any of those issues. So my go-to are porous containers like terracotta, fabric, or concrete, because they actually allow your potting soil to breathe. It draws out excess water, and it helps create pockets of air, which prevents compaction. And it also makes it easier for soil organisms to exist in that space. These gaps of air also allow heat exchange between the soil, the pot, and the environment. So if it's a particularly hot day, your plant roots won't fry, which is actually a pretty important aspect. You know, I planted in a metal container one year and put it right out on my porch, the sunniest place, and the plants died instantly because there was none of that insulation. So on the other hand, we have plastic, metal, and fiberglass, which are considered non-porous. The downside is that they don't support your soil organisms as well that you're cultivating in your pots. But the positive, it locks in moisture and eases your watering demands. With porous containers, they quickly dry out. With non-porous containers, they definitely hold on that water retention a lot more. So again, there's no perfect container. You just have to really know what you're working with. And my favorite container of all time is definitely the raised bed. And the reason for this is because it's easier to maintain than smaller pots because they don't dry out as quickly. And that larger mass of soil makes it easier for my plants to cope with the cycle of freeze thaw, which is common in this environment, which can upheave roots and actually shatter pots. So the larger container is also more likely to keep a living community of soil organisms alive from one year to the next, not just within one season. They also drain better. There's less danger of root rot during rainy seasons. And if you think you don't have the room for a raised bed, you know, you can actually think creatively. I've seen them in all sorts of strange places like alleyways, right outside people's front doors of apartment buildings, and even in that weird strip of no man's land between the street and the sidewalk. So if you look hard enough, you can find places to park raised beds almost anywhere. The number one takeaway talking about containers for your climate victory garden is it has to have drainage. There's just no way around it. And if your pot doesn't have drainage, it's easy enough to drill holes into the bottom of the pot or poke holes with a screwdriver and a hammer. If you're using a decorative pot without drainage, I recommend using what I call the pot inside the pot technique. So you just put a base of gravel or draining material at the base of your decorative pot and slip in your liner pot, which is usually a lightweight plastic pot that already comes with drainage holes. And that way, when you fill up and water your pot, there's still a bottom space for that water to drain, which will just prevent all sorts of nasty molds and mildews and root rots. And, you know, poorly draining containers are the number one reason that container gardens fail. So I'm asked this question all the time. Do you use new potting mix each year, or do you choose to rehab your old potting mix? And I personally, unless I've seen serious signs of disease and decay from a certain container, I like to rehab my old potting mix. And that's because I'm working all season trying to maintain a living soil community within my pots, specifically my larger pots. So I don't want to lose that progress. So I rehab it by just adding some more compost or compost-rich potting mix into the bag. And the other thing, it's pretty impractical if you are using large planters. It's pretty impractical to dump it out and start fresh every year anyway. So unless there is the chance of passing on a disease, I leave the potting soil in place and aerate it by jabbing the top of the soil with a pitchfork or a trowel. And then I just scoop out enough of the potting soil to make room for at least 4 new inches of fresh compost. And I found that by doing that, it completely rehabs any old potting mix. And I know I don't want to oversell being able to maintain living soil from year to year in small pots, because quite frankly, that's difficult. And there's not that much research shown on the efficacy of small containers being able to support a lively soil ecosystem. But I'm certain that with my large containers, and this is say 10 gallons or larger, I know I am nourishing an existing population of healthy soil organisms each season. So it's important to just keep feeding them either with more compost, more organic matter, and they'll just be happy and thriving. So there are all sorts of container gardening's kind of taking off, and it's really exciting. When I first started, I experimented with the easy things like herbs for the most part, maybe the occasional tomato plant. But I've since learned that just about any food crop that does well in any backyard garden can also do well in containers. There are some that do better than others, namely the small ones. And for that reason, you want to look for compact fruits and vegetables. And many of my favorite seed companies like Johnny's, High Mowing Organic Seeds, they've piloted breeding programs that are actually focused on creating container cultivars, which is really exciting. There's also this project called the Dwarf Tomato Project, which was established in 2005. And it worked with growers from around the world to find varieties of naturally small tomatoes. So far, they found 70. I actually just potted up what they call a micro tomato, which grows in a 6-inch pot. I'll be curious to see how many tomatoes I actually get from it. But the novelty of it is kind of cool as well. So you can check out any of your favorite seed companies, and a lot of them are starting to curate specific lists for container specific varieties. And I'll just mention one of my favorites is that oxheart carrot there in the corner. I have a windowsill planter inside of my kitchen, and it's filled with these little carrots, and I just think they're adorable. So keeping your garden healthy, whether it's inside or outside, is relatively straightforward. Again, I want to stress that it's really important to refresh old soil with fresh compost and some of those soil boosters that I talked about, including the inoculants. It just can never hurt. It can only help. And it's what's going to make container gardening easy. If the soil is living, it's doing all the work for you, so to speak. So keeping it that way will go to your benefit. I will mention that there are a few differences between indoor and outdoor gardening, most notably indoors, believe it or not, but you should dust your plants. That's especially your perennials, trees, things that are growing many, many months indoors. That thin layer of dust can actually prohibit photosynthesis. It is just, you just take a damp cloth and gently wipe off the leaves. It's a pretty funny house chore, but it's definitely worth it. The other thing you want to remember if you're growing solely indoors is that you might have to hand pollinate your plants. So some plants are self-fertile and do most of the work either with a slight breeze or if you can shake your plants. Other plants actually need the pollen from one flower transported to the anther of another flower. So that's just something to keep in mind. I kind of skirt around that. because it can be quite time consuming, by just making sure my indoor plants get some outdoor time. So once the weather warms up in the summer, I move all of my trees outside, all of my indoor containers outside, and I just let my plants have a little time in the real outdoors, in the real sunshine, and they always benefit immensely from that. The last thing with upkeep is, I think the number one reason why container gardens fail, besides poor drainage holes, and this is a related, is people just water them way too much. So I call it loving your plants to death. And it's very easy to overwater containers. So it's just something to keep an eye on. I usually wait for the first inch or two of the soil to dry out before I actually go in and water again. So I appreciate you guys hearing me out on my new hobby of tiny victory gardens. You can find these books, any of these books I know are related to the bookstore sale through this conference. I invite you to check them out, and you can stay in touch by email, follow me on social media, and I'm excited to answer some of your questions.
Well, thank you so much, Acadia. That is wonderful. And I know we do have a lot of questions already, and I'd like to actually start with one of my own before we get into audience questions. I don't know if you mentioned it. I think you mentioned at the beginning that you grow hops.
Yes, I do.
I was wondering, who do you grow hops for? What beers could we try with your hops?
That was one of my favorite questions. So I grow hops for what is called the Hop Yard, and it's based just outside of Portland, Maine. So we sell hops to, I mean, if you're a real beer lover, you've probably already drinking them. You know, we do the big guys like Bissell Brothers, Allagash, Rising Tide, Great Rhythm, Liar's Bench. So we're really excited that the beer community is a really fun agricultural community to be a part of. When I was a market gardener and mostly a CSA farmer, the age group was a little bit older of people interested, but the agriculture surrounding beer is a very lively, very fun community.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah. Nikki, do you want to read off some questions for us?
Yes.
Okay.
You might have answered this a little bit already, but if there's anything else to say, Tim had asked, what kind of outdoor large pots do you recommend for these winters, and where do you source them from?
That's a really good question. Again, I'll always say my favorite large outdoor container is always going to be a raised bed. But I have started to experiment with these poly planters that some are self-watering, which is a handy tactic. But the reason I kind of like these larger plastic containers is that I can leave them outside for the winter, and for the most part, they won't break. If you are dealing with ceramic pots, terracotta pots, that constant kind of freeze thaw cycle, the soil expands. You know, I've seen so many shattered pots at the end of a winter that I'm starting to experiment with a little bit more durable material, although you do have to weigh the pros and cons with, you know, well, is the soil allowed to breathe as much with some of these other porous containers versus the non-porous containers. And in terms of sourcing, you know, I love supporting my local nurseries. So I try to, as much as possible, buy what I need from them before kind of searching online.
Thank you. And we have two questions from Diane. So the first one is, I have a really hard time getting herbs and flowers to germinate outside. Would you recommend starting them in pots indoors?
Absolutely. I love to start seeds inside for my garden outdoors anyway, just because I'm not very patient. So it's kind of like instant gratification. I pop plants in my outdoor garden and it already looks full and beautiful. But the advantage of starting seeds inside is that you can kind of control the temperature a little bit more, and then you can also use a heat mat. So a lot of herbs and flowers benefit from being from a very warm soil temperature, 70 to 80 degrees. So starting them inside allows you to utilize a heat mat, and I'd have you try that if you're having bad success with germinating seeds outside. The other problem with germinating seeds outside is it does require pretty consistent watering, because the seeds are, especially flower and herb seeds, they're very, very tiny. So they're not planted very deep, and maintaining a moist soil layer for those seeds to germinate can be a little bit difficult outdoors.
Thank you. And the second question is, with your containers, are you top dressing with more compost when you do your second or third plantings? And how long do you use the soil before adding more or switching it out?
That's a great question. So the answer is I do try to top dress when I'm switching crops in and out, because again, like, there's no such thing as too much compost in my opinion. So if there's a moment that you can add it, definitely add it. In terms of how long I'll keep using the same potting soil, it's usually throughout a season before I'll kind of start to rehab it again with that, a fresh 1-to-1 ratio of new stuff. But for perennial plants, say citrus trees, you're not really able, the only time you're able to refresh that soil is if you're up potting it into a bigger home. So I take that opportunity for my perennials to make sure that I'm putting in more compost at the bottom of the pot, around the pot, and just having that extra space, making sure it's filled with the most compost rich potting mix I can find or make.
Nice. Thank you. And then we had a question from Amy that was answered a little bit by people in the community chat, but just in case you had any other thoughts or ideas, Amy had asked for any tips for filling raised beds less expensively. And some of the comments that came in were like adding stumps and logs,
Sure.
leaf litter, things like that, to fill it up. If you have anything else.
Yeah, I actually enjoy that same sheet mulching technique that I used to build soil at my farm can actually be modified to create almost, I guess, relatively free soil in a raised bed, kind of with that layering technique of green materials like grass clippings, food waste, with brown materials like straw, compost, wood chips, things like that. So you can kind of find these materials anywhere, ask your neighbors for their leaves. I'm sure they'll be happy to give them to you. And you can kind of build this layered kind of, I don't know, people call it lasagna pile too, in your bed. And then it does take some time to break down and it will shrink. So I always like to top off that, how much it shrinks with just fresh compost on top. And you can, like I said, it's almost free if you use the materials you have readily available to you.
Thank you. Penny asked, what kind of grow lights do you use?
I've experimented with many, many, many different grow lights over the years. I'll say you get what you pay for. So most likely, the more expensive a grow light is, the better it will work. Right now, I've kind of been experimenting between what's called broad or full spectrum grow lights, which provide more than just the wavelengths plants need to photosynthesize. There's a lot of research on what exactly plants need. And for a long time, it was just focused on growth and photosynthesis. But a lot of new research is coming in that there's a lot of different other wavelengths that plants respond to as well. So I would look for, no matter what grow light you purchase, I would look for a broad or full spectrum one.
Thank you. Brianna asked, can you talk more about overwintering the outdoor plants?
Sure. So if you have annuals, Obviously, they're not going to survive the winter, but you want to take care to prevent that pot from breaking. So a lot of times, if I'm leaving a pot empty for the winter, I'll cover it with a tarp and a bungee. I like to use the brown tarps because they're not quite as loud as the bright blue tarps. So you don't have to look at that every day. But if I have perennials in pots, I try to make sure that the soil level isn't overflowing, so that if there is some expanding of that soil, it's not going to crack the pot as easily. You can also move them to a more sheltered location in your house. So if you have a protected corner, that will, be safer from the wind, let's say, I would definitely take that opportunity to move it there. You can also move if you have an unheated garage, these plants are dormant, so they don't really need sunlight. So if you move them into an unheated garage, again, that's just going to help the temperature remain a little bit more consistent and help prevent any of that unwanted breakage.
Thank you. And Robert asked if you have a few most needed indoor pest control strategies.
Sure. The beautiful thing about growing in containers is they're small enough where I do hand pick off pests as I see them. But the most annoying pests, and I actually have one buzzing around my head right now, are those little flies that come out of the compost. And they are harmless, so I try not to worry about them too much. But there are some pretty bad indoor pests like scale, for example. So I'll use neem oil or horticultural oil, and once that's sprayed on a pest's body, it pretty much just prevents it from doing its normal bodily functions, and it does unfortunately die a little bit of a slow death. But just having a spray bottle of that on hand can take care of almost every indoor pest that you might see.
Great. Chris mentioned, she liked that you mentioned the oxheart carrots and wonders what your favorite edible flower might be.
Ooh, that's a tough question. I think I'd have to say I really do enjoy nasturtiums because I like that pepperiness that they add to, say, a salad, and they come in all sorts of awesome colors. My favorite one I grew last year was salmon colored. And it just, I think I'd have to play it safe and go with nasturtium. But I also like borage as well. It has like a kind of like a cucumber taste to the flower. I try to pair, like I've mentioned, I like to grow flowers with my food to support pollinators, but I try to pick edible flowers as well. So it's kind of a complete package.
Thank you. Paul and Denise have a question as well, and they say, we grow citrus trees in pots, which we move in and out seasonally. We've had some success with limes and lemons that are tightly pruned and pot bound. Do you have any tips for citrus growing better in New Hampshire?
Yeah, I'm experimenting with my own citrus at the moment. And I've found that tight prune is good, and they do like a smaller pot with not as much room. It helps the soil stay a little bit drier, helps it prevent root rots and stuff like that. But one of the things that I found is the most beneficial, particularly when you're moving things from inside to outside. I learned a lesson the hard way that, plants like gradual change. They don't like to be shocked. I made the mistake this year of taking my lime tree in from the cold and immediately putting it in my house. And within 3 days, every single leaf was on the ground. So learning to be a little bit more patient and kind of focus on a gradual transition, bring the plant in for a few hours, then put it back outside, and vice versa, no matter if you're going from inside or outside, or the other way around. Just taking things gradual and slow will make the plant a lot happier.
Yeah.
Willa said that she uses nasturtium as a trap crop for aphids and asked if you have that issue. She says she places them all around the veggie garden in pots to keep them off the rest of the garden.
Absolutely. Yep. I love nasturtiums for that fact as well. And I think any opportunity that people can take to kind of have these trap crops amongst their prized crops is just a great way that we can kind of, you know, keep any pesticides down to a minimum. And, you know, if you're not worried it's going to hurt your plant, I tend, for at least my container gardens, to let bugs be until it's a big issue. I can live, now that I'm not commercially growing vegetables, I can live with a little bit of blemishes on my produce.
Well, that's all the questions that I see right now. Someone had asked, oh, there's a new question. Well, I was going to say that someone had asked where they could find your books in the NOFA bookstore. So I did put that link into the chat. We'll drop it in there again before the end of the session too, so people can find that. And Robert asked, oh, could you introduce your other books, particularly Growing Perennial Foods? Some of the 34 plants are not normally considered perennial.
Sure, I know, I get that. I love that question. The basis of my books are really meant for the beginner. So some of the plants in the perennial foods book, as you say, aren't normally thought of as perennials, say tomatoes, for example, but you can grow tomatoes perennially. You know, in their natural environment, they do grow quite well as perennials. There's also some self-seeding annuals listed in there as well, to create the idea of a perennial bed. So maybe the plant itself isn't growing perennially, but the space it occupies is perennially filled with that crop. In both of those books, Growing Good Food and Growing Perennial Foods, focuses on that soil-centric approach of building microbially rich soil in the efforts to help combat climate change. And the idea that if we all team up and just take care of our little slice of land that we have, the cumulative actions of all of ours can add up to something quite powerful.
Thank you. I see Chadley put the links in the chat to not just the bookstore, but also the exhibitor fair, our program guide, and also the workshop links. Thank you. And I don't see any other questions right now. Does anyone, if anyone has any question, they can pop it in the chat, or if Acadia, if you have anything else you'd like to mention, or Chadley, maybe Chadley has a question.
Well, I don't have any more questions. Certainly, Acadia, if you have any final comments you'd like to make, you have time.
Yeah, I just like to thank everyone for sitting in here and listening to me talk for an hour. It's been real fun.
Well, it's been our pleasure. I'm sure everyone here would agree. And thank you so much. And glad to have you as part of our community. I want to tell everybody real quick about the next workshop we've got coming up, which is a seed panel with High Mowing and Johnny's and Fedco organic seed companies. We've got a representative from each. We're going to be sitting down and having a conversation to sort of lift the veil, you know, behind the seed world. So, and then of course, after that, we've got our keynote coming up, and that's going to be a very special session with Mukhtar Idow, the executive director of the Organization for Refugee and Immigrant Success right here in Manchester, New Hampshire. And they have a lot of agricultural based programs that I know everyone's going to enjoy learning about. They're making a real difference here in our community. And so with that said, you know, I just want to say thanks again, Acadia, and thanks everybody. Next session starts at 3 o'clock. So we've got about 20 minutes to get up and do some jumping jacks. Yeah, all that stuff. And so I think that's it for me. Nikki, anything else?
Yes, thank you very much. I think the only other thing I'd mention is that it's hopefully you're inspired even more to start your indoor and outdoor gardens. And NOFA New Hampshire has a bulk order program where gardeners and farmers can order bulk products. No order is too large or too small. I'm just looking for the link that I'll pop into the chat here. And the order deadline is February 28th. So you can check that out too for some of your gardening supplies. Thank you.
All right. Well, thanks everybody. And Acadia, have a nice afternoon, evening, and hopefully we'll see everybody over at the next session.
Excellent. Thank you, guys.
Okay.
Thank you.